Good evening and welcome to the studio in Johannesburg, South Africa, where I'm sorry to be this evening and not to be in Athens at this edition of the Nostos Festival, a wonderful occasion for reflection, for celebration, for enjoying what the human mind does when it's at its active and its most lively. We're in an era now of extreme uncertainty. No one predicted the pandemic that would arrive. No one has been certain how best to deal with it. This very performance this evening is one response to the circumstances in which we find ourselves. And I want to talk, when I'm describing the project this evening, about uncertainty, about what it is to be living with uncertainty, which in a way is the necessary condition of being in the studio, for an artist to be in the studio, in which accident, chance happenings, new discoveries made in the process of making are part of the way we understand the studio operates, and which is the raw material from which some meaning has to be constructed. And I'll talk about this, I think, in relation to the specific project that would have been on stage in Athens over the period of this Nostos Festival, but which has to be replaced for this edition at any rate with this description of the work and of its process. I want to talk about fate and either finding one's fate or escaping one's fate, and how this happens in the studio. So the studio is both a physical space of making, but it's also a place of making meaning. And very often the processes which are direct and completely visible and obvious in the studio, a piece of charcoal, a piece of paper, and ink painting, reflect processes which we all have in all spheres of life, but which normally are invisible, or we take for granted. And that the stupid, the uncertain, the changing ways of understanding the world that are the raw material of the studio, taking a piece of paper and hoping it will be transformed into something that has a meaning, that these echo a wider sphere. And there's a way in which the studio itself, the movement around the studio, is a kind of an enlargement of our head. As if the ideas which would normally travel a few millimeters from one part or a few centimeters from one part of our brain to another are echoed in the walk around the studio of 5 meters, 8 meters, 10 meters, and the peripheral vision of the drawings we've had yesterday, the newspaper cuttings, the postcards, all the natural materials of the studio are a kind of echo of the other parts of the world that we normally see, news reports, telephone calls, dreams, memories, altercations on the street, from which, from all these different fragments, we have to construct a coherent sense of who we are. And in the studio, this is natural. All the different fragments of the world come in, they get transformed, and then they get sent back out into the world, into, in this case, a performance called Waiting for the Sibyl. So there's a way in which we're expanding our head into the studio, and the studio becomes a place for testing ideas. And sometimes when they're tested, they're finished, they do go out into the world as something concrete and specific, but the real making is in a much less precise and instrumental way in the studio. The project that was due to be shown at the Nostos Festival is a chamber opera called Waiting for the Sibyl that was first shown in Rome 2 years ago. 1 year. It seems so long since this lockdown in Johannesburg and the lockdowns in so many other parts of the world. Before I get to the Sibyl, I have to talk about the paradox of the extraordinary danger and uncertainty that surrounds the studio and the house or the garden in which I'm living and locked down with my family, and the extraordinary luxury of having 10 weeks uninterrupted in my studio over these last 2 months. And both have to be heard. It's not simply a pleasure and it's not simply an anxiety. Both of these contradictory feelings are there and present. But to talk about the Sibyl. The Sibyl is a prophetess. We remember that Apollo wanted to seduce her, and she agreed in return for everlasting life. But when it came to the crunch, she actually refused Apollo. So Apollo said, well, that's fine, but remember you asked for everlasting life, but not everlasting youth. And so the Sibyl became older and older and older, until in the end she shrunk, and she was just a minute size, and she lived in an amphora. And if you put your ear to the amphora, you could just hear her calling out, let me die, let me die, let me die. But the story of the Sibyl that I'm interested in is the Sibyl is a person who would know your fate. You would go to the Sibyl with a question, and she would write your fate on the leaf of a tree. And you would go to collect your fate, which had been written on this leaf of a tree, but as you approached the mouth of the cave where the Sibyl lived, there would always be a wind blowing, and the leaves at the mouth of the cave would swirl up into a vortex. So you never knew if the leaf you got was your fate or someone else's fate. There was a fate, but you couldn't know if you were getting it or not, if you could escape it or you were meeting it. And this is the element of the Sibyl that I was interested in, the chamber opera. And it was made for Rome Opera. It was made by Nhlanhla Mahlangu, a South African singer, actor, composer, dancer, and Kyle Shepard, a jazz pianist. They were the two composers. And we had a cast of 6 other singers and 2 dancers and an actor. And through them, we tried to work out what was the story we could be telling. But to start at the beginning, what was the starting thought I had? That was the thought of the leaves on which the fate was written. And the leaf is also a page of a book. So one could think of these thousands of leaves of a tree as the hundreds of pages or the thousands of pages that accumulate in databases, in encyclopedias, in dictionaries, in files, in bureaucracies, on which histories and fates are written. And we would find ways in which the spinning and turning of the leaves could be repeated. So this combination of tree and leaf became an important element of how we thought of the circular turning motion of the Sibyl. And so one of the early starting points was to do literally paintings of trees, like this painting of a tree, which I would paint on different pages of old encyclopedias or old dictionaries, and which could then be blown up into the air like confetti to see what happened. Now, obviously, we had to train the paper to land in the correct way. In this, the artist is always a kind of a figure who is working against entropy, trying to defy entropy. Instead of saying everything will fall into chaos, to say from chaos we will construct coherence. From the different elements of a collage, a coherent center can be made.
go 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 kumako shwe 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 I'll shred him a go, 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 I'll shred him a I'll shred him a shred go 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 kumako 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 shred I'll shred him a go, 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 I'll shred him a
Old books are interesting because things like reference books, dictionaries, encyclopedias, unlike novels or other books, are almost obsolete. It's much easier to keep a dictionary up to date in its online form or an encyclopedia than to constantly reprint it. So there are lots of old, unwanted books of this nature which make their way into the studio, where I very happily dismember them and paint on them and use them in different ways. So that was the question of the tree. The tree also, in a way, comes into the story of the Sibyl in Dante's Paradiso, the very, very end. He talks about all the pages that have been swirling around, all these different pieces of information in the world, swirls around like the leaves of the Sibyl and get gathered together into a single book, in his case, the Divine Comedy. But the book and the tree became an important theme. And one of the films we made for it, one of the sequences in the opera, an important one, is the very fact of the book. We used it in many different ways, but largely thinking about texts, fragments of texts, which could be one's fate or could not be one's fate. The way these projects work in the studio is that there's obviously some period of drawing and some idea of a theme, but the heart of it always happens in our first workshops, in which actors, singers, musicians are brought together, and with some idea of a starting point, but no idea of an end point. We improvise, we test different pieces of music, we see what sort of movements and actions suggest different things, and hope in this process to discover the heart of what we do. Here I will now show you some of the workshops we did in Johannesburg in the early stages of Waiting for the Sibyl. It took place in my studio, and with, as you can see, different musicians, singers. We'd initially thought that all the music would simply be recorded, but as you'll see when we started working with these particular singers, it was clear it would be crazy to take away their presence, and the way their presence also transforms the music they're making, and to work just with a recording. So we informed Rome that I know they were expecting simply recorded music, but to do the project that was not possible.
imagine yourself as a typewriter. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Luba mesabikanile chopa sephala lahluma othatha bubase.
In Johannesburg, we have a small art centre called the Centre for the Less Good Idea. Not the good idea, but the less good idea. Which is to say, a centre which specifically looks at what are the ideas that you don't anticipate, the fate you don't anticipate, but which still arrives from the edges, from the sides, chance discoveries, chance meetings of images and texts. And these become central to what you're doing. So this workshop, which uses these principles, is vitally important. And in this we tested different kinds of music, ranging from traditional African singing, music also based on Stockhausen's Stimmung, and sought to see what kind of sounds would emerge. What would be the voice of the Sibyl? If the Sibyl was going to be ecstatically proclaiming fortunes, what kind of voice? So we had a wonderful dancer, Teresa as our Sibyl, and an extraordinary vocalist and dancer, Polly, who combined to find a different voice and body for the Sibyl. Something that emerged in the process of the workshop, but which carried through into the final performance. So we have about a 5-day or an 8-day workshop with a costume designer, with a set designer, with composers, with people taking videos, with the editor considering what will be the projections behind the performance as it happens. And at the end of this first workshop, there's a lot of raw material, like all the fragments on the walls of the studio that are ready to find a combination. And then there's a serious process of kind of reflection of what things that we did were interesting and what things are completely uninteresting. Not to say that every improvisation is going to be wonderful, but when they are, one sees it immediately, and there's something that you can feel viscerally, in your armpits, in your taste buds, of something exciting happening. And that's the hope in the workshop and in the studio, of finding a place where a non-rational consciousness, where a much more emotional consciousness, a much more bodily consciousness lets you know that you're on the track of something which may eventually be of interest in a cerebral way as well. I'd always been intrigued by the story of Perseus in relation to the question of fate. I don't really need to remind this audience of the story of Perseus. We all remember that King Acrisius of Argos asked his oracle, his Sibyl, how long he would live, and the Sibyl wouldn't tell him, but said he would be killed by his grandson. And so King Acrisius has Danae, his daughter, locked in a chamber so that she cannot get pregnant. But Zeus, the king of the gods, sees Danae, and he approaches her as a shower of gold. He impregnates her, and the hero Perseus is born. After many adventures and growing up and attempts to drown him, which don't work, Perseus turns into a hero, and he goes to the cave of the Gorgons and he kills Medusa. And then he decides he is going to come back to Argos, to King Acrisius, to explain to him that the oracle was wrong. He has no need to kill King Acrisius, all is forgiven. And in fact, on the way home, he decides to stop at Larissa to take part in the athletics games that are being held there in Larissa. But in the meantime, King Acrisius has heard the story of Perseus, how he didn't die, how he grew up to be a hero, how he's gone and killed the Gorgon, and he hears that Perseus is on his way back to Argos. So King Acrisius immediately remembers the Sibyl, remembers the oracle, and he fears that Perseus is on his way to kill him. So he escapes. He disguises himself as a beggar with ashes and sackcloth and flees Argos. In Larissa, at the athletics competition, Perseus takes the discus. He takes part in the discus competition. He allows the strength in him to grow. He launches the discus, and it flies up, past the markers, up into the stands, and there on the back row, it strikes and kills an old man, a beggar in ashes and sackcloth. Now, when I first heard the story as a child, this was intolerable. Why did King Acrisius have to go to that athletics competition? Why did Perseus have to be such a show-off? If only King Acrisius had sat one seat to the left or one seat to the right, he would have been safe. How could all these different things come together so that whatever they did, the fate was going to meet King Acrisius? This troubled me, that you would never know if you were taking the right step or the wrong step. Was this chair the right chair or the wrong chair? Would this chair collapse and that chair be safe? Would this be the chair in the aeroplane that didn't crash, or would you jump into the chair that was the plane that did crash? How could you know if every evasive step you took was in fact a step right in front of the oncoming blow? That every evasive action would meet the decisive strike. So this is a kind of a deeply rooted psychic anxiety, I could say, that I had. And in a way, the piece, The Waiting for the Sibyl, had to do with the calming down, with the thinking about this. So we also played with a chair, following that story in the workshop, without knowing quite how it would mean, what it would mean. Here you can see the first improvisations with chairs that collapse, part of the episode on the right chair or the wrong chair. Finding one's fate or avoiding one's fate. And can one ever successfully avoid the fate? You obviously do, because there are thousands of other fates which aren't yours, but which might have been. There's that sense of one can think of one's whole life as a non-stop series of narrow escapes, as well as thinking being life made of unfortunate coincidences. But one can also think of every day that passes without a disaster as being a series of remarkable coincidences of disasters avoided. We gradually accumulated the voice of the Sibyl. We accumulated the movement of the Sibyl, of her being filled with this knowledge of the world around her. We had a scene of people sending their request, of trying to think, what is the world that is held inside an old piece of paper? If you listen to it, what do you hear? If you took an object, what would you be hearing of its history? What is the desire of an object? What is the words that it can't say but which we feel are in it? Bring me home, bring me home. One thinks of all the museums around the world full of objects taken from other areas. What are they wishing? What is the desire of those objects? And so we had those kinds of scenes. We had a scene of the Sibyl and the pages of a book as a central element. The texts that were arrived at were a collage. I'm not a writer, and so the work had to be of found text, and there were texts from many, many different poets, from translations into English, but from many different languages, from Finnish, from Hebrew, from Russian, from Polish, from Czech, from Tswana, from African languages, other African languages. And we put all these different elements together in what became a 40-minute chamber opera. The opera itself is 7 or 8 scenes, divided by different droppings of the curtain into new elements and new thoughts, but held together by the sense of the rhythmic turning of the leaves, or of a fate, or the very turning of the world, or the turning of the walk around the studio. That sense of trying to grasp some meaning or some sense which we feel is just eluding us. Something that's on the tip of our tongue but we can't quite say. Where we can hold the fragments but can't quite construct the coherent new vase in the center. Now I will show you some extracts from the dress rehearsal and performance of the opera in the Rome Opera House, to give a sense of how the different pieces finally came together. On the reliability of prophets. Heaven is talking in a foreign tongue. We adore other gods now. These are some of the words of the libretto of the Sibyl. Old gods have retired. I no longer believe what I once believed. The nearer the Inferno, the greater Paradiso. The execution site is never empty. Beware of the streets after dark. Beware of mobs of secret agents, of telegrams. Beware of insects with moustaches. Throw out all envelopes, last year's socks, last year's dreams, last year's hopes. These are not real stars. Hold on to your shredded thoughts. Hold on to the jagged blanket, the 7 vital phone numbers, the instructions and guarantees. Tie every guilt around your ankle. Avoid meetings, stadiums, the hard rocks, the heavy spade. It is useless even to beg to slip past the bullet, not to be born again, not to find your fate, to find the life jacket, to find the shelter and the food. Wait once again for better gods. Wait once again for better people. We adore other gods now. The machine will remember for us. You have been swindled because heaven is talking in a foreign tongue. The machine doesn't tire. The machine doesn't drink to excess. The machine will never toy or dance the Charleston. The machine says, beware of the age of 73. Tomorrow will be cloudy with intermittent sunshine. There will be one happy man in northeastern Brazil, I believe. The machine says, your turn is not next. Forget the smell of eucalyptus leaves. Forget the smell of the wind as it once was. Let them think I am a tree or the shadow of a tree, a doubt or a shadow of a doubt. There will be no epiphany. Your days will become years, your years will become places, but no place will resist destruction. You will live longer than a horse, but not nearly so long as a crow. Death grows its tree inside of you. Inside of you is lodged the stone of death. It is too late now. All you must understand, you will never see that city. Start dying assiduously, wisely, optimistically. Waste no time. All the names burnt with the rest, you will be alone on the plain. You will never see that city. And where shall we put our hope? Sleep. Sleep. You have nowhere to go. Day will break more than once, all so different from what you expected. But joy will overtake fear. Love will paralyze the joints, no protection but each other's limbs, the smell of the neck, 15 minutes on the soft shoulder. Something has been postponed. To what end? I want to end with further elements from the book, which is projected behind the dancer in the live performance, but which also has its own life as a book of turning pages that are filmed, that contain the heart of the thinking and making of Waiting for the Sibyl. The tree becomes a central image, both in the sense of holding all the leaves, but also in more than that. The tree becomes a shadow person. There's a way in which one can think about death, and obviously this period of the pandemic has been a period of premature mortality, of people dying when they hadn't expected to, of that subject being much more present. We read every day the lists of the infected, the recovered, the critically ill, and the dead, and see how different parts of the world are managing. In South Africa, we're just getting into a large growth of new cases, as opposed to many places in Europe which are now at the other end of this growth and seeing their way out. But the tree becomes a kind of double. One can think of one's death growing with one. One knows that as the moment you're born, you're predestined to die. There's no escaping that. But there's a sense of one's death growing inside you like a tree. And the hope and one's work in one's life is to allow that tree to grow and to flourish, so that by the time you die, there is this magnificent tree fully grown inside you.
Arena